Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Konstantin Izvolsky. I'm Director of Consulting and Training in Foresight Science and Technology. And today we present you with the next webinar in the series of webinars we prepare for the Wisconsin Center for Technology Commercialization. Our presenter today is Ed Case. Ed Case is a senior consultant with Foresight Science and Technology. Ed is a strategic planning and business development executive with more than 25 years of business-to-business experience, including 15 years of SBIR, etc. technology commercialization. This experience spans various technologies, including aerospace systems, scientific instrumentation, industrial equipment, software, and medical devices. In his role, Mr. Case supports organization with strategic planning consulting, facilitation and execution, fractional business development, business plan development, facilitating business model canvas and value proposition canvas, marketing plan creation and execution, and many others. Mr. Case received his Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Clarkson University and his MBA from Colorado State University. The title of his presentation today is Developing a Marketing and Sales Strategy. Thank you, Ed, and welcome.
Thanks, Konstantin. So as we look at how you move from the technology that you have to actually producing revenue with it, your marketing strategy plays the largest role in that. So because it is a strategy, it's going to be the big picture. Everything builds from this big picture strategy. Then you start to add in the tactics, how you actually implement things, and that's typically your marketing communication plan. That should generate the leads that feed into your sales process, and then as you close sales, that results in revenue. So most companies, and particularly startups, are pretty close to their roots, that they really understand why they exist, why the company was founded. So I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, that actually to get back to the core of what you do, and then to start build your planning processes and things on top of the why you exist. So the why tends to center around what your company values and what your competencies or expertise is in. As you get into developing technology, the first thing you have to realize is what problem is it that you solve? And start with the exact problem. Think exactly what it is that you do, and then start to try and widen the circle to what are similar problems that are out there. And that kind of defines what all of the market segments or application areas you might address are. For example, I used to work for a company that designed plasma simulation software. And the funding behind that was from the Department of Energy to help them manage their particle accelerators. And that kind of defines a niche market. I mean, particle accelerators for the Department of Energy, you can probably count on, maybe 4 hands how many of those are out there. But as we started to peel the onion and look at who has a similar problem, plasma simulation can be used pretty generally for anybody who does a plasma process. So now you can look at fabrication of semiconductors. You can look at applications in space propulsion. You can look at some things in aerodynamic behaviors that all benefit from understanding behaviors of plasma. So that's what I mean when figure out the exact problem and then try to widen your view of who else may have a similar problem. As you think you understand what the problem is and who has it, you now need to validate that. So you need to figure out who has the problem and think of problems in terms of pains and gains. So either you are eliminating something that is detrimental to your customer, or you're giving them the ability to improve something about some aspect of their operation. And customer discovery is really the only way to do this. And there's a lot of programs, NSF does their I-Core program, and they really stress talking to your customers. And the best way to do that is to try and build a hypothesis of what you think the problem is and what the aspects are of your customers, and then in a very non-selling manner, do interviews and find out what it is what problems they face, how they would like their life improved, what do they use currently, how do they buy things. So the customer discovery part is part of validating and defining the problem so that you can, if you need to, make adjustments to the technology that you're delivering. And an example of this, I was judging a pitch competition, and there was a company that described this process perfectly, where they had defined a problem. If you're familiar with the online wallets like Mint, they had a product that was a shared wallet. So it was a mine, yours, and ours kind of setup with managing money. And they were figuring that when people got into a relationship, that's when that technology made sense. And it turns out that it wasn't that point in the relationship, but it was when they get to a major milestone, like buying a house together, having a family, doing things like that. So by doing customer discovery, they found out that their demographic was probably about 5 years older than they thought it was, based on where they thought their technology solved an actual problem for the customer. So as you get into the value proposition, this is how you're going to communicate with your customer. So features and benefits are great, but you have to look at things from your customer's perspective. So, and you need to have two messages, and the messages have to do with you, particularly in a business-to-business scenario, if that's how your company derives its revenue. You're typically going to have the actual users of your product who likely are technical recommenders who influence the buying decision, but they may not necessarily have a budget authority. So you also have to have a value proposition that addresses an economic buyer, some return on investment. So an example here might be, say you had software that was used in a medical practice, and what you could say to the technical recommender is, it fits in with your current workflow and makes you more efficient. That sounds like a great thing. The economic buyer probably wants one step further. You say, and you can see 3 more patients a day. Now they've got a monetary unit value that they can put on things and start to the trade-off versus of your price versus the value they're going to see. So think about value propositions. This is the messaging that goes on your website, in all your social media posts, on all your product collateral and literature. So value proposition is an important part of understanding what the value is to your customers, seeing things from your customer's perspective rather than your perspective as a developer. And then you need to understand the marketscape. And what I mean by that is you need to understand things like, well, what's the competition? So what you should have gotten from your customer discovery is, what does the customer do currently? How do they solve the problem? And even if it's woefully inadequate, you still have to displace whatever they're used to doing. Are there substitutes? And the less than elegant picture off to the right shows a substitute for a hammer. You can use a rock. So again, people may choose things that aren't the best solution, but they're what is available or what they can afford. And then figure out who the direct competitors are. Who does something very close to you? And one other one to be aware of is, this happens a lot in software, is a lot of times people may write little programs to do what they need to do internally. And if there's an internal champion and there's an internal solution, sometimes you run into a not invented here mentality where it's hard to displace something because they're not used to bringing in software from the outside. So you're gonna have to figure out what the value proposition is that makes them want to do that. The other thing is you have to understand where your prospective customers go to find information about emerging technologies in their industry. From past experience, I can tell you with medical devices, people go to conferences that have referee papers. Not everybody gets to present, or peer-reviewed journals. There's a higher standard. If you're in software, it may be conferences, but it could be something like local meetings or even blogs. So understand where your customer goes, and then you have to understand aspects of the sales cycle. So how do they buy things? If you have a high price point product, you may have to understand what people's purchasing limits are. How much can a particular manager sign off for budget-wise? You may have to determine for a large purchase whether a lease might be a lower barrier to entry, because leases tend to be operating expenses, whereas acquisitions are capital expenses, and capital expenses sometimes is a much longer budgeting process. You need to know how often they buy. Take the average consumer. How often do they buy a car, for example? And then you need to, who decides? Who has the final authority? The other thing you also have to realize is what your channel might be. And an example I use, and again, this is very simplistic, but it gets the point across. If you manufacture thermometers and you want to sell to hospitals, you don't go knock on the door at the hospital and sell them thermometers. You have to find the medical supply company that takes all of those types of things, thermometers, bandages, whatever, and sells to the hospital. So you're going to have an indirect channel possibly. And those are things that your customer discovery can tell you. So the classic way of looking at competition is this diagram off to the right, which is Porter's 5 forces. It's a methodology used pretty commonly for figuring out what are all the things impacting your market. But it's important you know your place in the market. Are you the market leader? If you're not, who is? If you are, how close are your competitors? How fragmented is the market? What's your market share? If it's an emerging technology, can you get first mover advantage? Can you be the first one into the market? Because then everyone's playing catch up with you. If you're in a commodity market, you're probably going to have to compete on price. So there you may be dialing back what features you offer so that you can keep your costs in line so that you still generate reasonable margin based on what your price is. But at the end of the day, you have to differentiate your product. And typically, it comes down to better, cheaper, faster. And usually it's any two of those three. So understanding the competition is an important thing. And the other thing I might add is look at their website and see what kind of messaging they use, because that may be the right messaging for the industry, or you may be able to come up with better messaging. And as you create your message, you want to convey value. So your message focuses on the customer's need, not your product's features. So as an example, we see a gentleman in this ad wearing a backpack. And TSA compliant size is a feature. Traveler convenience is a value. And people buy more based on value. And just like the message says, bring everything you need without checking a bag. So think about, again, your message should speak to your customer. It shouldn't be necessarily educating your customer. It should be talking about how you solve their problem. Building credibility, we touched on this a little bit. So if you're get an opportunity where you have customers that are your champion, supporting them in presenting at conferences, doing placements in publications, whether they're online or print, having someone else tell your story gives you more credibility than if you have to tell it yourself. Certain research has to be published in peer-reviewed journals. We talked about that. Industry conferences are a great way to do things. I know with COVID, that's been an issue because most things have gone virtual. You don't get the same experience, but again, as industry conferences are starting again, knowing if that's where your market listens, is an important thing. Referenceable accounts are huge. If you can have the capability where if you're in a sales situation, someone says, can I talk to one of your customers? Having someone like that is great. If you can't have that level of conversation, just having testimonials or endorsements on your website can be useful. So one of the things that's changed over the last 30 years is the impact of a website and the web in general. So it used to be the sales process started with a lot of education by the salesperson to the customer, and that's changed. Having a web presence is very important, and it kind of short circuits that information teaching process, because your customers tend to be very well informed. They're going to search for solutions on the internet. The first question is, can they find you? And that gets into some of the search engine optimization aspects. Does your message really resonate? Does it talk to what the customer's need is, what value it is they're looking for? Is your website well laid out? Do you have good supporting information? Do you have white papers? So how do you put things there? And anytime you communicate with your customer, there should be a clear call to action. So if you give a webinar, maybe it's call a salesperson, ask for a demo, visit our website. So doing things that are very deliberate. So you want to make sure that there's a clear call to action. You don't want people guessing at the end of a presentation or at the end of an article or at the end of a YouTube video what it is you'd like them to do. This is one of the challenges, is measuring your success. So I've managed a sales force, I've managed a marketing organization, and it's always, we're spending money at such and such a venue or in such and such a campaign to generate leads. Are they turning into sales? So what you want to do is develop measurable goals. And I like to use the SMART goals analogy. So SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And time-based is very important. You'd like to know what your sales cycle is. If you do a trade show in January, do those leads turn into revenue in March or in July or in September or a year later? So having a handle on things like that. So setting goals like, we will get 10% of our leads from Photonics West, which is a electronics trade show that happens usually in the first quarter of each year, and they will convert to sales within 6 months. So you've kind of brought in those aspects of how you're going to measure that particular campaign or that particular source of leads. Just like you have to understand all the aspects of your marketing plan, there's a sales plan. What you need to eventually do is, when prospects come in, 3 things that are helpful is to know the need, budget, and time frame. If they don't need your solution, they're probably not going to buy it. If they haven't already budgeted for your technology or your product, then you may have to wait a year till the next budgeting cycle. And then time frame. I have my boss tasked me with solving this problem by Q3 of this year. So now you can start to think about when you may actually realize revenue from your interaction with your potential customer. So until you kind of establish these things, you're just having a nice conversation. You really haven't qualified this sales prospect. And then it's good to also understand, how do you move from a lead to a sale? And when you look at that, a tool that used to be very common and has kind of fallen out of favor, but I still like to use it, is the sales funnel. Think about, like, when someone responds, fills out a form on your website, they're probably more of a suspect than a prospect. They think they have a need. Prospects tend to be qualified. You've had a conversation with them. You understand why they contacted you, what they're looking for. They become a lead when you get to that need, budget, time frame known. And this is just a sample. So these percentages happen to have worked for a customer I've worked with, but you need to put your own metrics in there. You know, active prospects, sometimes they need to, you know, it's a try before you buy. They want the equipment in-house and use it. They want to test drive the software. If you're a software as a service, they want a demo account to actually do some things. And nothing is a sale till the order is actually received. That's when, you know, you've come to the end of the sales funnel. And if you look on the left-hand side of the sales funnel, again, this is an example. In your actual mileage may vary a little bit, but you can see that this particular company has a 20-week sales cycle. It typically takes 20 weeks to move through each level of the funnel to get to that final order received. So that's an important thing to know as you're doing forecasting and cash planning, is knowing what your sales cycle is. So in your sales model, we're going to ignore the graphic for a few minutes and first talk about, how do you think you get revenue? Is it a one-time sale? Do they buy it and they go away? Do they buy it and they have a service contract? Do they buy it and there are consumables? Sometimes, like with medical devices, there may be, you know, reagents or other things that they have to buy periodically to continue to use the equipment. Does your market prefer rental or leasing as opposed to outright acquisition? And that may depend on your customer. When I used to work in the geotechnical markets, we did geotechnical surveys to support major construction projects. So the big engineering companies own all their equipment for doing that, ground penetrating radar and different instruments. Smaller companies can't afford that, so they lease it on a project basis. So, you know, do you have a market where you're selling to the big firms? And you also have a market where you're selling to a rental shop, and the value proposition is different. So for the big firm, your technology solves the problem. For the rental shop, their customer cares that it solves the problem. What the rental shop cares about is your equipment doesn't sit on the shelf gathering dust. If they buy it to rent it out, they want it in use all the time. That's the only way they make their money back. So think about those aspects of a sales model. And I already mentioned the continuing relationship. You know, are there going to be consumables? Is there a service contract? And think about retention. You know, if you do have a service contract, what percentage of your customers continue with service? You know, do 80% of them stay or do 10% of them stay? It's 10%, you probably have a different problem to solve, but knowing what your recurring revenue is going to be is important. And so like in the cell phone industry, it used to be, this is from years ago, it was a couple $100 to acquire a customer. That's why when you would call and threaten to cancel your phone contract, they would typically offer you like a discounted phone or something like that, because if you leave, it's going to cost them $200 to replace you. So knowing what your cost of acquisition is for customer and what your retention rates are real important. One of the things that comes up a lot is, you know, you hear about software as a service, platform as a service, and a lot of people go to that service model. Typically, it's like a monthly subscription, so you've got a good regular recurring revenue, something investors like to see, something management likes to see. And people always are struggling with, what exactly does software as a service mean versus, you know, a paid up license, or in this case, the on-premise license. So I use this graphic, pizza as a service, because I think most people can, you know, make the transition from a made at home pizza to a take and bake pizza to having pizza delivered to going out to a pizza restaurant. So I offer that as kind of a introduction to the X as a service model of sales. So when you get to your sales channel, there's two choices. Direct channel is simple. You have salespeople, they work for you, they do what you tell them to do. If you're starting from scratch, it can be expensive. If your selling model is you're selling to doctor's offices, you need a lot of salespeople to call on every doctor's office. If it's you sell into hospital systems, now things are a little better because that could be statewide, but it could be regional. So the plus is they do what you tell them to do. The minus is it's usually a fairly expensive process. Indirect channel is kind of the flip. Typically, when you find an indirect channel, and there's lots of nuances to that we'll go into, you find someone who has a technology that's typically complementary to yours, so adding your product is a plus for them, and they're already talking to the customers, so that gets you to your customers more quickly. The problem is you don't own or direct this channel, so you have to do something to keep their attention so that they keep working for you as opposed to working for any of the other product lines that they carry. So let's talk about that in a little more detail. And one thing to realize is you may do hybrid. You may do both of these things. A fairly common one is that maybe in the US, you have a direct channel. It's fairly easy to reach. You understand all the laws and regulations. But when you go to your first international sales, you may choose to use an indirect channel because it gets rid of language barriers, it gets rid of cultural barriers, it gives you feet on the ground in the geography you're selling into. So sometimes people do that hybrid model where they do direct within their country, in this case the US, and they do indirect as they start to expand into international channels. So this is a question you get all the time, or I get all the time. So I'm going to hire a direct channel. What kind of salesperson do I need? So it's important that they understand the industry. It's probably more important they understand the industry than they understand your specific technology, because you can educate them on that. One of the things you have to be careful of is sometimes people come in and say, I've brought my database from my last employer. That's probably against their employer's employment agreement with their previous employer. So watch for things like that, because that edges on, is that really ethical behavior? Talking to who you know is one thing. Actually bringing dumps of databases is really not a good industry practice. Figure out how they match your company culturally and with level of maturity. If you're a startup and you're in a lot of cases the founder's doing sales and they want to not do sales anymore so they can focus on other parts of the business. So you may need a level of maturity where someone is pretty self-directed. You can't have someone that's too junior because now you've added a new task to your growing list of things to do, which is managing someone who's at a certain level of maturity. And then the flip side can be true as well. If you get someone who maybe has been in the industry but comes from a big company where they have a lot of support mechanism, there's an admin who puts stuff into the database, and there's someone else who does fulfillment, and there's someone else who schedules their appointments, they may not have the right skill set or the right workflow to work for a startup because they're used to a larger support network than you currently afford. So, and sometimes what can be useful, particularly if you've got a very technical product, is to do team selling. Have someone who's sales process focused sorted or supported by a technical sales support person who can do demonstrations or answer technical questions or do more of the nuts and bolts and get their hands dirty with the customer. So that can be a model that works in direct selling. So indirect channels can be very different. So you get everything from distributors, people who just kind of do a pass-through. They keep it on the shelf and they sell it. You may get what's called a value-added reseller, where typically they're taking your product and another product, bundling it together and selling something that's closer to a complete solution, or what's sometimes called a whole product. An example of that in the early days with computer-aided design software, in a lot of cases, they had value-added resellers who bundled the computer-aided design software with a computer system capable of running it, and what the value-added reseller or VAR would deliver is a turnkey system. You plug in the computer, you turn it on, the software is pre-installed. I talked a little bit about international distributors. So there's a lot of different things that you need to be aware of. The nice thing is, again, we mentioned they're already selling to your customers. So for you, it shortens the time to actually get to sales with those customers. The benefit to the reseller or the indirect channel is they don't have to find a new customer. They can get additional revenue by selling more to people they already know. So there's a win-win in the indirect channel. But care and feeding is extremely important. If your product isn't easy to sell, then the channel will sell something that is easier to sell. Most salespeople look for the shortest path to compensation, shortest path to revenue, shortest path to commission. So even if you don't have a sales force and you're using an indirect channel, you probably want some person or persons whose title is something like partner relationships. And they're the ones that make sure that your indirect channel is educated and able to sell your product, that they have the right collateral, that they're getting the support when questions come back to headquarters about the technology. So care and feeding is very crucial to have a successful indirect channel. And when you recruit those people, you need to vet them just like they're an employee, because you're putting in their hands your revenue attainment. And I tend not to give exclusive selling relationships, just because if something doesn't work out, you don't want to have a hard time still attaining revenue in a certain market or geography. And then just like marketing, you have to measure results. So revenue attainment, people assign sales quotas. I know as a sales manager, typically when we assign sales quotas, they added up to about 105 to 110% of the number we actually wanted to hit, because some people are going to overperform and some people are going to underperform. So you want to make sure that the sum of all the parts is always going to get you to the goal. And I highly recommend using things. A good tool is, a customer relationship management system, a CRM. Salesforce is the one most people are familiar with, but there are other tools out there, because what you would like to be able to track is, for every sale that comes in, you would like to know where it came from. So closed loop lead tracking means we attended this conference, this person responded, they went into our sales funnel, we closed them 6 months later, so I know the whole cycle of our relationship with this customer. And what that does is allows you to emphasize the marketing tactics that are resulting in more sales, and possibly change the mix and eliminate the ones that aren't as successful. We talked about the CapEx versus OpEx, knowing when people's budget cycles happen, and knowing who is signature authority for the level of commitment or level of revenue you need to get is a very important part. So that kind of walks you through the progression from marketing strategy to marketing plan to sales plan. Some resources I mentioned early on. Start with why. Simon Sinek does a great job. He uses a lot of examples centered around Apple, but why your company exists feeds into your different strategies. Crossing the Chasm is a age-old book by Jeffrey Moore, highly recommended. One of the analogies that's good there, particularly as you're trying to prioritize markets you're entering with a new technology, uses a bowling pin analogy. So as your head pin, pick a market that's accessible, but know that early adopters in that head pin market are referenceable to the other markets you want to get to, so that that head pin can knock over the other pins in the bowling alley analogy. So recommend Crossing the Chasm, and for customer discovery, I think Talking to Humans is a great resource. And there's other resources available online, but these are ones that I suggest. So with that, that's my presentation. If there are any questions that have come up as a course of listening to this, the CTC knows how to get in touch with Foresight. They can refer questions to us, and we're happy to respond as things come up. So with that, thank you for your time and attention today.